What if one moment of injustice could spark change across an entire city? Landon Hayes, a successful black entrepreneur, is wrongfully detained outside a luxury hotel, accused of a crime he didn't commit. Instead of staying silent, he fights back, developing a powerful app to hold law enforcement accountable. But the road to justice isn't easy. As tensions rise, and even the officer responsible, Caleb Rowe, faces the consequences of his own actions. Will Landon's fight lead to lasting change or tear the community further apart? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to follow more stories like this. Now let's dive into The Weight of Words, a journey of justice, redemption, and transformation. Landon Hayes sat in his modest sedan, staring at the clock on the dashboard as it clicked closer to 3:01 p.m. The air inside the car felt heavy, and Landon took a deep breath to clear his head. He had just finished an exhausting day volunteering at the community center he had founded, his hands still smeared with remnants of paint from the morning's work. Despite the lingering fatigue, he was energized by the thought of what lay ahead. A meeting with some of the city's most influential investors. This wasn't just another business venture, it was personal. He looked down at his worn jeans and paint-splattered t-shirt, a sharp contrast to his usual polished appearance. For a moment, he considered heading home to change into something more professional. But there wasn't time for that, and besides, he thought, my work is my identity. The investors he was meeting had seen his suits before. Today, they would see the man behind them. With a final glance in the rearview mirror, Landon climbed out of the car and approached the grand entrance of the hotel. The sun reflected off the glass doors, casting bright patterns on the pavement beneath his feet. He straightened his shirt, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips as he pictured the future. The lives that would be transformed by the affordable housing project he was spearheading. Families who had struggled for years would finally have a safe place to call home, all thanks to this project. It was the kind of impact he lived for. Across the street, Officer Caleb Rowe leaned against his squad car, watching Landon with a scrutinizing gaze. His mind worked rapidly, piecing together assumptions based solely on what he saw. A black man, dressed in shabby clothes, walking into one of the city's finest hotels. Rowe's pulse quickened. He had seen this kind of thing before, or so he thought. Just doing my job, Rowe reminded himself as he pushed away from the car and began crossing the street toward the hotel. The tension in his shoulders built with every step. He'd been on edge all week, with stress at home and an ever-growing workload at the station. In his gut, something felt off about this guy, and Rowe wasn't the type to ignore his instincts. "Hey, you!" Rowe's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative, as he closed the distance between them. Landon stopped mid-stride, surprised by the harsh tone. He turned slowly to see the officer walking toward him, hand resting casually on his utility belt. Confusion flickered across Landon's face, but he kept his expression calm as years of experience had taught him. "Good afternoon, officer," he greeted with a polite nod, hoping to diffuse whatever tension was brewing. "What's your business here?" Rowe's voice held an edge that wasn't lost on Landon. "I have a meeting inside," Landon explained, keeping his tone even. "I'm meeting with some investors about a new project I'm working on." Rowe's eyes scanned him from head to toe, skepticism etched into his every feature. "A meeting? Dressed like that?" His tone dripped with disdain, as if Landon's casual clothes alone were evidence of some wrongdoing. Landon felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew where this was headed. He'd experienced it before, more times than he could count. "Yes, I just came from a charity event," he explained calmly. "I didn't have time to change." Rowe didn't budge. His eyes remained locked on Landon's, a silent challenge hanging in the air. "Let me see some ID." Landon sighed inwardly, forcing himself to remain composed. "Of course," he said, reaching for his wallet. "I understand." But before he could hand over his ID, Rowe's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Hands where I can see them!" Landon froze, his pulse quickening. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Passers-by stopped, phones in hand, recording the unfolding scene. "Officer, there's no need for this," Landon said quietly, lifting his hands. "I'm just here for a meeting." But Rowe wasn't listening. His mind had already made its judgment. "Turn around," Rowe ordered. "Hands behind your back." Landon's heart sank as the cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The humiliation of it all hit him in waves, the weight of countless eyes watching, the sting of being treated like a criminal in front of strangers, simply for existing in a place someone thought he didn't belong. 3 hours later, Landon sat in the back of his lawyer's car, his wrists still red from the cuffs. The sting of humiliation burned deeper than the physical pain, though. He had been released after a quick call from the hotel's manager, Mr. Harris, who had confirmed Landon's identity. But the damage had already been done. Social media was ablaze. The video of his arrest had been shared hundreds of times, with comments split down the middle. Some decried the incident as blatant racial profiling, while others defended Officer Rowe's actions as merely following procedure. As they drove, Landon's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, texts from friends, emails from concerned colleagues, and social media posts tagging him in the now viral video. His assistant, Rachel, sat beside him, reading some of the headlines aloud. "Black millionaire arrested outside luxury hotel," she recited from one of the many articles already making the rounds online. Another one says, "Racial profiling or standard procedure. Debate rages after businessman's arrest." Landon closed his eyes, leaning back against the seat. "I can't believe this is happening," he muttered. "I've done everything right. I've followed the law, built my business from the ground up, and still, this." Rachel reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "We'll fight this," she said firmly. "You have every right to be here, to build what you're building. We won't let them take that from you." Landon nodded, though the knot in his stomach remained. This wasn't just about him. It was about every black man or woman who had been judged, harassed, or humiliated based on nothing but skin color. But was he ready for the fight ahead? As they pulled into his driveway, Rachel turned to him. "Eli wants to talk to you," she said, referring to his lawyer, Eli Davis. "He thinks we should take legal action." Landon sighed, rubbing his temples. "Of course he does, and he's probably right. But this—" He trailed off, unsure how to voice the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "This isn't just a legal matter. It's about the bigger picture." Rachel nodded, understanding. "I know, but sometimes the only way to get people to listen is to make noise." The next day, Landon sat in Eli Davis's office, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The lawyer's office was sleek and modern, a sharp contrast to the chaotic emotions running through Landon's mind. Eli, a seasoned civil rights attorney with a reputation for tackling high-profile cases, leaned forward, his sharp eyes studying Landon carefully. "Landon, you need to understand something," he said, his voice low but firm. "What happened to you isn't just an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern, and we need to take a stand." Landon ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "I know that, Eli, but dragging this through the courts? It feels like I'm becoming part of a spectacle." Eli leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. "This isn't about spectacle, it's about justice. What Officer Rowe did to you was wrong, plain and simple. He racially profiled you, and he needs to be held accountable. More importantly, we need to send a message to the entire system that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated anymore." Rachel, who had accompanied Landon to the meeting, nodded in agreement. "He's right, Landon. People are already talking. The video has gone viral, and there's a movement building around this. You have a platform, use it." Landon sighed heavily, feeling the weight of their words. They were right. He knew that. But the thought of becoming the face of yet another fight for racial justice felt overwhelming. He hadn't asked for this. He just wanted to build homes for people who needed them. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. Across town, Officer Caleb Rowe sat in his living room, staring at the television. The news anchor's voice droned on, reporting on the latest developments in the viral arrest video. Roe's face was plastered across the screen alongside Landon's. His wife Anna sat beside him, her face pale with worry. "Caleb," she said softly, "this is getting out of hand. People are saying terrible things about you online. What if it affects your job?" "The kids?" Roe clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "I was doing my job," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "That guy looked out of place, and I followed protocol." Anna reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I know you did, but maybe you should apologize. It might help calm things down." Roe pulled his hand away, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Apologize? For what? For doing my job? No way. I didn't do anything wrong." Anna bit her lip, unsure how to respond. I don't want this to get worse." Roe stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the room. "It's not going to get worse," he said firmly. "I did everything by the book, and I'm not going to let some video and a few angry people online ruin my career." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his mind. He had watched the video, seen the looks on the faces of the people filming him, and heard the muttered accusations of racism. Could they be right? Had he crossed a line? He shook the thought away, refusing to entertain it. He wasn't a racist. He was a cop doing his job, and he would defend that until the bitter end. As the days passed, the public outcry over Landon's arrest continued to grow. Protests formed outside the police department, with signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Landon" and "End Racial Profiling." News outlets ran interviews with activists, lawyers, and community leaders, all demanding accountability from the police department. Landon watched it all from a distance, torn between pride and frustration. He was proud that people were speaking out, that his experience had sparked a movement. But at the same time, the spotlight was exhausting. Every time he turned on the TV or opened his phone, there was another headline, another video, another heated debate. One evening, he sat in his living room, the dim light from the TV casting long shadows across the room. Rachel had called earlier, asking if he was ready to take the next step, to file the lawsuit, to officially take a stand. Landon stared at his phone, Eli's number flashing on the screen. He knew what he had to do. The world was watching, and if he didn't act, this moment would slip away. But the weight of it all was overwhelming. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed. "Eli," he said when the lawyer answered, "let's do it. Let's file the suit." The lawsuit filed by Landon Hayes hit the news like a lightning bolt. The headlines screamed from every media outlet, "Millionaire sues city over racial profiling incident." Landon's name became synonymous with the fight against racial injustice, whether he liked it or not. For days, Landon stayed holed up in his apartment, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on him. Every time he opened his phone, a new wave of notifications flooded in, some offering support, others filled with venom. The world had taken sides, and he was caught in the middle. Rachel came by every day, insisting that he eat, that he sleep, but Landon found both difficult. His mind wouldn't stop racing. The lawsuit was filed, the wheels of justice were turning, but he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. What if nothing changed? What if this was just another story, another viral moment that faded without leaving a lasting impact? One evening, after days of avoiding the news, he turned on the television. His face appeared on the screen, followed by a clip of Officer Caleb Roe in a carefully curated interview. Roe sat straight-backed, his expression tight, as the anchor asked him about the incident. "I was following procedure," Roe said, his voice measured. "I didn't know who this man was. He was dressed inappropriately for the location, and I had to assess the situation. I acted in the best interest of public safety." Landon felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. Dressed inappropriately for the location. He could barely process the words. Roe was doubling down, refusing to acknowledge the racial undertones of what had happened. The camera cut to the anchor, who recapped the incident with neutral journalistic detachment. But then, the next segment began, a panel of commentators discussing the lawsuit. The conversation quickly spiraled into a debate on racial profiling, personal responsibility, and policing. One guest, a prominent pundit, dismissed Landon's claims outright. "I think this is being blown out of proportion," the pundit said. "The officer was doing his job. People can't expect to act suspicious and then not be questioned just because they have money." Landon turned off the TV, unable to listen any longer. His heart pounded in his chest, his emotions a tangled mess of frustration, fear, and disbelief. How could they not see it? How could they not understand? Rachel found Landon sitting on the floor of his living room the next morning, his back against the couch, staring blankly ahead. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table, and the television was off. She set down the coffee she'd brought, eyeing him with concern. "You need to get out of here, Landon," she said gently. "You can't keep wallowing like this. It's not good for you." Landon didn't respond at first, his mind still replaying the words from the night before. Blown out of proportion. That phrase had clung to him like a weight. He shook his head finally, exhaling a long, shaky breath. "They don't get it," he muttered, more to himself than to Rachel. "They'll never get it." Rachel knelt beside him, her eyes softening. "Some people will never get it, but that's not who we're doing this for. We're doing it for the people who do understand, for the ones who've been through this and worse." Landon closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the couch. "I don't know if I can do this, Rachel. This fight, it's bigger than I thought." "You don't have to do it alone," Rachel reminded him. "You have Eli, you have me. And there are so many people out there who are supporting you. They're just not as loud as the ones tearing you down." Landon opened his eyes and looked at her, the resolve slowly returning to his face. "You're right. This isn't just about me. It's about something bigger." Rachel smiled, standing up and offering him a hand. "Good. Now come on. You need a change of scenery. Let's go to the office." Landon took her hand, pulling himself to his feet. His legs were shaky from days of sitting, but as he stood, he felt something stir within him. Something strong, something determined. He couldn't give up now. At the office, Landon found Eli and a few members of his legal team gathered around a whiteboard, their voices hushed but urgent. Eli spotted him first, offering a tight smile. "Landon, you're just in time. We've been talking about the next steps." Landon nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose as he took a seat. "What's the plan?" Eli leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Landon's. "We're still moving forward with the lawsuit, but I think we need to start thinking about the long game. This is bigger than just one case of profiling. We need systemic change." Landon listened as Eli laid out a strategy for pushing not just for financial compensation, but for real policy reform within the police department. Mandatory racial sensitivity training, body cameras, community oversight. It was ambitious, but that wasn't what grabbed Landon's attention. "We also need to think about how to prevent this from happening again," Eli continued. "That's where your influence comes in. People know who you are now, Landon. They're listening, so let's give them something to act on." A spark ignited in Landon's mind. He had been so consumed by the fallout from his arrest that he hadn't considered what he could do next, how he could turn this moment into a movement. "We need more than just awareness," he said, the idea forming in his mind. "We need something that holds people accountable in real time. An app?" Rachel and Eli exchanged glances, intrigued. "Go on," Rachel said. Landon stood, pacing as he spoke. "An app that allows people to document incidents of racial profiling, police misconduct, anything like that, and submit them instantly. It would create a record, video, audio, written descriptions, time-stamped and geotagged. That way, there's no he said, she said. Everything is documented." Rachel's eyes lit up. "Landon, that's brilliant." Eli crossed his arms, nodding thoughtfully. "It's bold, but it could work." Landon stopped pacing, turning to face them. "We need to hit them where it hurts, their credibility. This app could hold the system accountable. People who have been silenced, who don't have the resources I do, they could use this to make their voices heard." The room buzzed with energy as they began brainstorming, mapping out the logistics of creating the app. Landon felt something he hadn't felt in days: hope. News of Landon's new project spread quickly. As soon as the concept of the app was made public, it gained immediate attention from civil rights groups, tech investors, and the public. Social media buzzed with anticipation. People saw the potential, a tool for real-time accountability, a way to empower those who had been overlooked for too long. But not everyone was on board. Officer Caleb Rowe, already suspended while the investigation into his actions continued, watched the news unfold with growing frustration. The app was being heralded as a game-changer, a beacon of justice. But to Rowe and many of his colleagues, it felt like a threat. In the darkened living room of his suburban home, Rowe sat on the couch, the glow of the television casting shadows on his face. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow officers, their comments laced with worry and anger. "They're going to turn the public against us," one message read. "How are we supposed to do our jobs if every move we make is being watched?" Rowe clenched his fists, scrolling through the messages. He had spent his entire career protecting the community, doing what he thought was right. And now, this app threatened to undo everything. It would make officers second-guess every decision, fearful of being accused of racism or misconduct. But what stung most was the way people had turned against him. He had received hate mail, threats, and accusations. His family was being harassed online. His children's school had been contacted by angry citizens. It was all spiraling out of control, and Rowe felt powerless to stop it. "I was just doing my job," he thought bitterly. But the world didn't see it that way. Unable to sit idle, Rowe began contacting some of his closest colleagues, officers who shared his concerns. They started meeting in small groups, discussing the implications of the app, their frustration growing with each passing day. "This is going too far," Rowe said one night during one of their meetings at a local bar. "We can't let this happen." "What are we supposed to do?" one officer asked. "The public loves him. The department isn't going to back us up. They're too scared of bad PR." Rowe leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "We need to fight back. Start a campaign against it. Make people see this for what it is, a way to undermine law enforcement." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Rowe's reputation had already taken a hit, but his words stirred something in them. A mix of fear, resentment, and the desire to protect their way of life. The city was buzzing with tension. In the weeks following the announcement of Landon's app, protests began cropping up all over. On one side, supporters of Landon's vision gathered with signs that read, "Accountability now," and "Justice for all." They marched in front of government buildings, chanting for change and holding up images of people who had been wronged by the system. But across the street, a counter-protest formed. This group, largely made up of law enforcement officers and their families, held signs that read, "Support our police" and "Safety first." Their chants called for order, respect, and support for the men and women in blue. The atmosphere was charged, with verbal confrontations breaking out between the two groups. Some hurled insults, others tried to engage in calm discussions, but it was clear that the city was divided. The app had become a symbol, a rallying point for both sides of the debate on policing and accountability. Landon stood at the edge of one protest, watching the scene unfold. The noise, the tension, the raw emotion in the air. It was all so overwhelming. This wasn't what he wanted. He had hoped for unity, for people to come together to solve these problems. But instead, it felt like the app had become a flashpoint for even deeper divisions. "Landon!" a voice called out, and he turned to see Rachel hurrying toward him. She looked worried, her eyes darting between the protesters. "This is getting out of hand." Landon nodded, his jaw tight. "I know. I didn't want this." "They're blaming you," Rachel said softly. "People are saying that you're turning the city against the police, that your app is dangerous." Landon's stomach twisted. He had anticipated pushback, but he hadn't expected it to feel so personal. He watched as two protesters shouted at each other from across the divide, their words filled with hate. This wasn't just about an app anymore. It was about the soul of the city and the country, and Landon wasn't sure how to navigate it. Landon Hayes stood in front of his desk, his office bathed in the early morning sunlight. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the table, notifications piling up faster than he could read them. Ever since the protests began, It seemed like the entire world was either supporting him or calling for his downfall. But there was no turning back now. The app was ready to launch, and despite the rising tensions in the city, Landon knew this was the right thing to do. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Rachel asked from the doorway, her face a mixture of concern and encouragement. She held a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, the other resting on her hip. Landon looked out the window, watching as the city below bustled with life. Somewhere out there, people were preparing for another day of protests, of debates, of trying to figure out which side of this battle they were on. "I don't have a choice," he said quietly. "We've come this far. We can't back out now." Rachel nodded, stepping forward to place the coffee on his desk. Eli called earlier. "He's working with the press to control the narrative as best he can. But you need to be prepared for the backlash, Landon. This isn't going to be easy." Landon gave her a tired smile. "Nothing worth doing ever is." She studied him for a moment, then sighed softly. "I know you're doing this for the right reasons, but make sure you're taking care of yourself too. You can't pour from an empty cup." He chuckled lightly, appreciating her concern. "I will. Promise." Rachel smiled, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "We're all behind you, Landon. Don't forget that." As she left, Landon sank into his chair, staring at the screen in front of him. The app's dashboard glowed brightly, displaying the first few reports that had trickled in since the soft launch. It wasn't just about gathering complaints, it was about creating a system that documented interactions, both good and bad, between citizens and police officers. The goal was transparency, not division. But with every notification, Landon felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. People were looking to him for change, for justice, and that kind of pressure was suffocating. "I hope this works," he thought, taking a deep breath. "I hope it makes a difference." While Landon worked on pushing the app forward, Officer Caleb Rowe found himself sinking deeper into despair. The protests, the media coverage, and the growing support for the app had left him feeling like his career and his life were slipping through his fingers. Sitting in the dimly lit kitchen of his suburban home, Rowe scrolled through his phone, reading the latest articles about the app. His face hardened with each word. He had been suspended from the force, his name dragged through the mud. And for what? For doing his job? His wife, Anna, entered the room quietly, watching him with concerned eyes. "Caleb, you've been at this for hours. Maybe it's time to take a break." Rowe looked up at her, his expression tired but determined. "How can I take a break when everything I've worked for is falling apart?" Anna sighed, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table. "I know this is hard, but fighting this battle alone isn't going to fix anything. Maybe you should consider apologizing. Maybe even reach out to Landon." Rowe's jaw tightened. "Apologize? For what? I didn't do anything wrong. I followed protocol. He's the one who turned this into a circus." Anna reached for his hand, her eyes pleading. "You know that's not true. Look at what's happening, Caleb. People are angry. The world is changing, and you have to change with it." Rowe pulled his hand away, his frustration boiling over. "So what? I'm supposed to just roll over and let them ruin me? Let them call me a racist?" Anna's eyes softened, and for a moment there was a heavy silence between them. She stood up, walking over to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "No, but you have to accept that things can't stay the same. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about our family, our community. It's about doing the right thing." Rose stared down at the table, the words sinking in but leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. But deep down, he knew Anna was right. Things couldn't go back to the way they were. The protests had grown larger in recent days. Every evening, crowds gathered in front of City Hall, waving signs, chanting slogans, demanding change. Landon's app had been met with overwhelming support from civil rights organizations and community leaders. But it had also drawn the ire of the police union and its supporters. The division in the city was palpable. Eli, always pragmatic, had warned Landon that the app would face strong resistance. But Landon hadn't anticipated just how personal that resistance would feel. Online trolls sent him daily hate messages, accusing him of trying to destroy law enforcement. His social media feeds were filled with both praise and venom, and it was exhausting to navigate through the noise. One afternoon, as Landon sat in his office reviewing a particularly vicious article from a local news outlet that painted him as a threat to public safety, Rachel burst into the room. "Landon, you need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. Her voice was tense, her face pale. Landon took the phone from her, his heart sinking as he saw what was on the screen. A video clip of an altercation between protesters and counter-protesters. The confrontation had turned ugly, with verbal exchanges quickly escalating into threats and aggression. One man had shouted racial slurs at a group of protesters before being restrained by police. The video was already going viral, further stoking the flames of division. "This is getting out of control," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "We need to do something before someone gets hurt." Landon watched the video in silence, his stomach churning. This wasn't what he had envisioned. The app was supposed to bring transparency, to create dialogue, to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. But instead, it felt like the city was tearing itself apart. "We can't let this happen," he said finally, his voice firm but filled with worry. "We need to find a way to bring people together." "This isn't what I wanted." Rachel nodded, her eyes searching his. "What do you want to do?" Landon thought for a moment, his mind racing through the possibilities. They couldn't control the protests, but they could control the narrative. "We'll hold a press conference," he said, standing up from his desk. "We'll explain the purpose of the app, why we created it, and how it can help everyone, not just the victims of injustice. We need to get ahead of this." Rachel gave a small, encouraging smile. "I'll get Eli on the phone and set it up." The day of the press conference arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. Reporters from every major news outlet had gathered outside City Hall, their cameras ready to capture whatever Landon had to say. The air was thick with tension. On one side of the street, supporters of the app held signs calling for justice and reform, while on the other side, counter-protesters chanted for law enforcement. Landon stood at the podium, his heart pounding in his chest as he surveyed the crowd. He hadn't planned to become the face of this movement, but here he was. The world was watching, and he had no choice but to rise to the occasion. Eli stood by his side, offering a nod of encouragement as the cameras began to roll. Landon cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the nerves roiling inside him. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. "I know that tensions have been high in our city recently, and I want to take this opportunity to address some of the concerns that have been raised about the app we've developed." The crowd was silent, listening intently. "This app isn't about attacking law enforcement," Landon continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's about creating a system of transparency that benefits everyone, citizens and police officers alike. It's about building trust, not breaking it. When we shine a light on our actions, we become better. We hold each other accountable." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I understand that some people are worried. They think this app will be used to target officers unfairly. But I want to make it clear, that's not what this is about. This is about giving people a voice. People who have been silenced, marginalized, and ignored for far too long. It's about ensuring that everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve, no matter who they are or where they come from." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Landon pressed on. "We're not asking for perfection. We're asking for accountability, and we believe that this app can help us get there." As he finished, a smattering of applause broke out from the supporters gathered behind him. But as Landon stepped away from the podium, he knew that the battle was far from over. The division in the city ran deep, and it would take more than a press conference to heal those wounds. Meanwhile, Officer Caleb Rowe's life was unraveling. The suspension had become a full-blown investigation, with internal affairs digging into his past. Rumors circulated about other complaints filed against him, and his colleagues were starting to distance themselves. He was becoming a pariah within the department. One afternoon, Rowe received a call from his lawyer. The news was grim. A series of documents had surfaced, detailing past incidents of verbal racism and questionable conduct during his time as an officer. The investigation wasn't just about Landon's arrest anymore. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for too long. "They're going to make an example of you," the lawyer warned. "You need to prepare for the worst." Rose sat in stunned silence, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, it was all falling apart. How did it come to this? He wondered, bitterness rising in his throat. He had never seen himself as a racist. He had always believed he was doing his job, keeping the city safe. But now, with his record laid bare, he couldn't escape the truth. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but deep down, he knew there was none. The system he had trusted to protect him was now turning its back on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Landon sat in the quiet conference room, staring at the reports displayed on the large screen before him. His app had been officially live for just a few weeks, and already the numbers were staggering. Hundreds of people from across the city had downloaded it, and reports were flooding in. The variety was striking. Some highlighted positive police interactions, while others documented more concerning incidents. Each report came with video, audio, and written documentation, creating a time-stamped record of interactions that couldn't be ignored. It was exactly what Landon had envisioned, a way to hold everyone accountable. Not just law enforcement, but the entire community. Rachel sat next to him, scrolling through the data. "This is amazing, Landon," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Look at all of these people, real people, using the app to make a difference." Landon nodded, though the weight of it all still pressed heavily on his chest. "It's a start," he said quietly, "but it's not enough. The reports are coming in, but the city's still divided. The protests aren't stopping." Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. "You've done more in a few weeks than most people do in a lifetime. You're changing things." Landon shook his head. "It doesn't feel like it." He glanced down at the list of reported incidents. Some were simple complaints about disrespectful comments from officers, but others were more serious, allegations of racial profiling, unnecessary stops, and searches. The app was bringing these things to light, but Landon knew that for real change to happen, the system itself needed to evolve. As if reading his mind, Rachel said, "You've already started a conversation that wasn't happening before. You've made people pay attention." Landon exhaled slowly, trying to push away the doubt creeping into his thoughts. "I just hope it's enough." Across town, Caleb Rowe sat in his lawyer's office, his face pale and drawn, as he listened to the legal team outline the reality of his situation. The investigation into his past conduct had revealed more than just a few isolated incidents. It had exposed a troubling pattern that couldn't be explained away. "There's no easy way to say this, Caleb," his lawyer said, his voice firm but sympathetic. "The department is looking to terminate your employment. They want to make an example of you." Rowe's stomach twisted as the words sank in. His career, his livelihood, everything he had worked for, it was all about to disappear. "They can't do this," Rowe muttered, though he knew the words rang hollow. "I did everything by the book." The lawyer sighed, glancing at the stack of documents in front of him. "They're arguing that your actions showed a pattern of racial bias. Even if you followed protocol, the public pressure is too high. They want to distance themselves from this." Rowe clenched his fists under the table, his anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. "This isn't fair. I was just doing my job." But even as he said it, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had crossed a line. He had always seen himself as a protector, someone who kept the city safe. But now, with everything laid bare, he couldn't deny that he had made assumptions, let his biases affect his decisions. His lawyer continued, "You'll need to prepare for a formal hearing. I'll do everything I can to help you, but the department's stance is clear. They want you gone." Rowe felt the weight of those words settle heavily on his chest. His career was over. There was no saving it now. The day after the press conference, Landon found himself pacing the length of his office, his mind spinning with ideas. The press conference had gone well, but the protests were continuing, and tensions were still high. The city felt like it was teetering on the edge of something much bigger. That afternoon, Landon received a call that he never expected. It was Caleb Rowe. Landon hesitated before answering, unsure of what to expect. His mind raced with possibilities. Anger, accusations, maybe even a plea for forgiveness. He hadn't spoken to Rowe since the day of the arrest, and the thought of facing him again made his chest tighten with unresolved emotion. Finally, with a deep breath, he answered. "Landon." Rowe's voice was quiet, the bravado that had once characterized him completely gone. I wanted to talk." Landon was silent for a moment, processing the unexpected vulnerability in Rowe's voice. "What do you want, Caleb?" Rowe hesitated. "I know this is the last thing you expected, but I need to make things right." Landon's grip tightened on the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. "Make things right? You can't undo what you did." "I know," Rowe said, his voice strained. "I know I can't change what happened, but I've been thinking about everything. About my actions. I was wrong." Landon's mind reeled. He hadn't expected this. Not from Rowe. "Why are you telling me this now?" Landon asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Because I've lost everything," Rowe replied, the rawness of his words cutting through the silence. "My job, my reputation, all of it. But the truth is, I deserve it. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt people. I hurt you." Landon's breath caught in his throat. This was the last thing he had ever imagined hearing. "What do you want from me, Caleb?" "I don't want anything from you," Rowe said quietly. I needed to say it. I needed to own up to it. I've spent so long justifying my actions, pretending like I was in the right. But I wasn't. I was wrong." Landon was silent, his emotions swirling in a storm of anger, sadness, and something he couldn't quite identify. He had spent months fighting for justice, pushing for change, and now the man at the center of it all was apologizing. "I don't know what to say," Landon finally admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Rowe replied. "I just needed to apologize. And I want you to know that I'm not fighting this anymore. I've accepted what's coming." There was a long silence between them, and finally, Rowe spoke again. "I hope you can find it in you to forgive me one day. But even if you can't, I'll understand." With that, the line went dead, leaving Landon standing in his office, the phone still pressed to his ear. He didn't know how to feel, whether to feel relieved or furious. But one thing was clear. Something had shifted. The days following Rowe's phone call felt surreal to Landon. He had spent so long viewing Rowe as the antagonist, the symbol of everything wrong with the system. And now, with that apology lingering in his mind, the world felt a little more complicated. Landon couldn't shake the conversation, nor could he forget the sincerity in Rowe's voice. For the first time, he saw the man behind the badge, the man who had made mistakes but was now grappling with the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, the app continued to grow in popularity. People across the city were using it to report incidents and share stories of both positive and negative interactions with law enforcement. The app was sparking real conversations between communities and police. And slowly, the city was beginning to change. At a community meeting one evening, Landon sat in the back of a crowded room, listening to local residents share their experiences. It was the first time since the protests had started that people were speaking to each other. Not yelling, not arguing, but talking. "I've been using the app for the past 2 weeks," said one woman standing at the front of the room. "And I'll be honest, I was skeptical at first. I thought it would just make things worse. But I've seen the difference it's making. People are more careful, more thoughtful. Officers are listening to us." A young man stood up next. "I had a run-in with the police last week. They stopped me for no reason. At least, that's what I thought. But I used the app to document it. Turns out, there was a legitimate reason for the stop. And instead of getting angry, I was able to have a calm conversation with the officer about it. That never would have happened before." Landon felt a swell of pride in his chest as he listened. This was what he had hoped for, a real change, not just in policies, but in the way people treated each other. At the end of the meeting, a group of police officers approached him, their expressions unreadable. Landon tensed, unsure of what to expect. But to his surprise, one of the officers extended his hand. "I'm Officer Rogers," he said, his voice calm and sincere. "I've been using your app, and I have to admit, I was against it at first. I thought it would make our jobs harder, but it's actually made things better. I think it's helping us rebuild trust." Landon shook the officer's hand, gratitude welling up inside him. "That's what we wanted all along," he said softly, "to build something better." The tide in the city was slowly turning. The protests were becoming less frequent, the conversations more productive. Landon's app had not only sparked change in his city, but other cities across the country were taking notice. Officials from Chicago, Los Angeles, and Atlanta were reaching out, eager to implement the app in their own communities. Landon found himself traveling more, meeting with police chiefs, mayors, and civil rights leaders to discuss how the app could be adapted to different cities' needs. His schedule was hectic, but every time he saw the impact the app was having, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. One afternoon, as Landon prepared for a flight to Washington, D.C., he received an unexpected message. It was from Caleb Rowe. "I just wanted to thank you," the message read. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. You were right. We needed to change. I needed to change." Landon stared at the message for a long time, the weight of the words settling over him like a blanket. It wasn't closure. There would always be more work to do, but it was a step toward healing. He tucked his phone into his pocket, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. And now, as he boarded the plane, he knew that this was just the beginning. Weeks had passed since Landon's app had launched, and though the protests had begun to fade, the city still felt the ripples of everything that had transpired. Landon found himself standing on the steps of City Hall once again, this time not as the face of a divisive issue, but as a man who had become a symbol of hope for meaningful change. His app was working. People were engaging with it every day, not just to report misconduct, but to highlight the positive interactions they were having with the police. It had become more than just a tool for accountability. It was becoming a bridge between the community and law enforcement, helping to rebuild trust. Slowly but surely. As Landon looked out over the city, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and smiled softly at the message on the screen. It was from Rachel. "Coffee at the usual place?" Landon typed out a quick reply. "Be there in 10. Rachel had been his rock throughout the whole process, always by his side, always reminding him that they were in this together. He often thought about how he couldn't have made it this far without her support. The usual cafe was bustling when he arrived. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air as Landon spotted Rachel sitting at their usual table, 2 cups of coffee already waiting. She smiled when she saw him, waving him over. "You're late," she teased as he sat down. Landon chuckled, shaking his head. "You know how things are. Meetings with city officials, phone calls with other states. It's never ending." Rachel's smile softened. "That's because you're making a difference. People want what you've built, Landon. It's not just about the app. It's about everything you've stood for." He took a sip of his coffee, nodding thoughtfully. "I know. It's just hard sometimes. We've come so far, but there's still so much to do." Rachel reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "And you'll do it? One step at a time." Landon looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. She was right. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. The city was healing, little by little, and that was something to hold on to. The day of Officer Caleb Rowe's hearing arrived quietly, with none of the fanfare that had surrounded the protests. It was held in a small, sterile courtroom where Rowe's future with the police department would be decided once and for all. Landon had been invited to attend, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to go. The thought of seeing Rowe in such a vulnerable position made him uneasy. He had spent so much time fighting against what Rowe represented that he wasn't sure how to feel now that things were ending. But in the end, Landon went. He knew that closure, if such a thing existed, would only come from seeing this through to the end. The courtroom was quiet when he arrived, with only a few people in attendance. Rowe sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. He looked like a shadow of the man who had once stood over Landon outside the hotel, full of authority and power. Now, he was just a man facing the consequences of his actions. The judge entered, calling the court to order. Roe's lawyer stood to make his final argument, but there was little to say. The evidence of Roe's past behavior was clear, and even his lawyer knew the odds weren't in his favor. When Roe was given the chance to speak, he stood slowly, his voice shaky but clear. "Your Honor," he began, "I know that I can't undo the mistakes I've made. I know that what I did was wrong. I allowed my biases to affect my actions, and I hurt people because of it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to take responsibility for what I did." Landon listened, his emotions mixed. Roe's words were a far cry from the man who had arrested him months earlier. It wasn't just an apology, it was an acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. And while it didn't erase the past, it felt like a step in the right direction. The judge gave a brief nod, acknowledging Roe's statement before delivering the final verdict. "Officer Roe," the judge began, "your actions have had far-reaching consequences, both for the people you've affected and for the police department as a whole. It is the court's decision that your employment with the department be terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, you are barred from serving in law enforcement in this state." Roe lowered his head, the weight of the decision settling over him. There was no outburst, no protest, just quiet resignation. He had known this was coming, and now that it was here, all he could do was accept it. As the courtroom emptied, Landon stood near the door, watching as Roe gathered his things. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment they just stared at each other. There was no animosity in Roe's gaze, just a quiet understanding. Landon nodded, a silent acknowledgement of Roe's apology, and then he turned and left the courtroom. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. In the weeks following Roe's hearing, the city began to stabilize. The app continued to gain traction, with more cities reaching out to Landon, eager to adopt the technology for their own communities. But as the national attention grew, so did the demands on Landon's time. One afternoon, Landon found himself sitting across from Chief Daniels, the head of the city's police department. It was a meeting he had been hesitant to attend, but the chief had insisted, claiming they had much to discuss. "I'll be honest with you, Landon," Chief Daniels said, leaning forward in his chair. "When your app first launched, we were all skeptical. The department wasn't sure how it would impact our work. But now we see the potential." Landon raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on?" "The app has helped us identify areas where we need improvement," Daniels continued. "It's given us valuable insight into how we can rebuild trust with the community. I won't lie, it hasn't been easy, but I think we're on the right path now." Landon nodded, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. "That's good to hear." Daniels smiled, though there was still a seriousness in his expression. "I'd like to propose a partnership. We want to work with you to improve the app, to make it even more effective. We're also implementing new training programs for our officers, focused on de-escalation and racial sensitivity. Your app has been a catalyst for those changes, and I think we could do even more if we work together." Landon leaned back in his chair, considering the offer. He had spent so much time fighting against the system, pushing for change from the outside. But now, here was an opportunity to create real, lasting reform from within. "All right," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." Months later, the city had transformed in ways Landon could never have imagined when this all began. The partnership with the police department had proven to be a success, with new policies in place that were directly informed by the data collected through the app. Other cities had followed suit, adopting similar measures in an effort to build trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Landon's life had changed as well. He was no longer just the businessman who had built a fortune. He was now seen as a leader, a change-maker. But with that new identity came a responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. One evening, as Landon walked through a park near his office, he overheard a conversation that brought a smile to his face. A young boy, no older than 12, was speaking with a police officer. The boy held up his phone, showing the officer how to use the app. "It's really easy," the boy said proudly. "You just press this button if something happens, and it records everything." The officer smiled, nodding as he listened to the boy's explanation. "That's great. I'm glad you know how to use it." Landon watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. It was a small moment, but it represented everything he had worked for. The app wasn't just a tool for accountability, it was a way to bring people together, to create a sense of shared responsibility for the community's safety and well-being. As the sun set on the horizon, Landon felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey had been long, and the challenges had been immense, but they had done it. They had created something that would last, something that would make the world a better place. There was still much work to be done, of course. The road ahead would be filled with new challenges, new obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, Landon felt hopeful. As he walked through the park, the sounds of children playing and people talking filled the air around him. And for a moment, Landon allowed himself to breathe, to reflect on everything they had accomplished. The weight of the world still pressed on his shoulders, but now he knew he could carry it. On the anniversary of the app's launch, Landon stood at the front of a crowded hall, addressing a room filled with community leaders, police officers, and residents. It was a celebration of everything they had achieved together, a testament to the power of collaboration and perseverance. He glanced out at the sea of faces, spotting Rachel in the front row, beaming with pride. Nearby, Chief Daniels sat with several of his officers, their expressions serious but respectful. "This app started as a response to a moment of injustice," Landon began, his voice strong and clear. "But it has become so much more. It has become a tool for healing, for rebuilding trust, for creating a community where everyone is heard, where everyone is seen." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. "But this is just the beginning," he continued. "We have a long way to go. There are still systems that need to change, still people who need our support. And together we'll keep pushing forward." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound filling the room and echoing through the halls. Landon smiled, feeling the warmth of their support wash over him. This was what they had fought for. This was the future they had built together. As the applause died down, Landon stepped away from the podium, joining Rachel and Chief Daniels at the back of the room. The atmosphere was filled with hope and possibility, and Landon couldn't help but feel proud of everything they had accomplished. "You did it!" Rachel whispered, her eyes shining. Landon smiled, his heart full. "We did it!" And as the night wore on, surrounded by the people who had walked this journey with him, Landon knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. If you found Landon's journey inspiring and want to see more stories that highlight the power of accountability, justice, and change, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Every story we tell brings you closer to the heart of the fight for equality, and we want you to be part of that journey.